Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible, the Indecision Series, Season 5, Episode 3, Episode 216, for those counting at home. Our topic of the week is Abraham's choice to leave the known. In this series that we started a couple of weeks ago on indecision, when people, our characters, are deeply in the decision-making process, they are in decision, they're in the process of making a decision, and then there's indecision in what they want to do, how they want to go, how they want to make those decisions. Our topic this week really dives into one monumental, universal decision made by Abraham at the beginning of his story. I hope you had a great week. This was a big week of big decisions and big choices in the U.S. election. All those elections at every different level. Here in Israel, the prime minister making a massive decision to fire his defense minister. This is a week of big decisions. And so I wanted to dive into this topic with you today. I want you to imagine for a moment living in the ancient world, living in Ur, where Abraham is born. It's one of the most sophisticated cities of its time. Let's say it's around 2000 BC. Ur, this place, is a thriving center of culture, wealth, and innovation. Think of it as being like the place to be at that time. The city where people go, it's, the city that never sleeps. It's New York, it's LA, maybe it's Tel Aviv, or it's some other city that you know, that you recognize, that is the heart of innovation. Archaeology has uncovered incredible structures that highlight that level of innovation and beauty in the ancient city. Most famously, the ziggurat of Ur, a towering temple that was dedicated to the moon god. Impressive architecture, advanced engineering. Really, it shows us the depth of Ur's devotion to progress and also to its faith. Life in Ur was rich in more than just monumental structures. It's buzzing with trade. It's connecting regions of the world. People maybe enjoyed some level of wealth. It's the heartbeat of the world at the time. The cuneiform tablets that have been found over the course of the archaeological digs that have been done there show a very organized and structured society. So living in Ur meant having access to stability, to the world's knowledge, to prosperity, and what you might call a fairly secure and fulfilling life. If that's where you were born, if, quote unquote, the gods had shined down on you and that's where you ended up, you won. Yet, God calls Abraham and requires him effectively to leave all this behind in making this command. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. To travel to a place that is far less developed. The land of Canaan, where God commands Abraham to go, is stark contrast to Ur. It's modest settlements, maybe it's small farms. It's way simpler, less structured, far more agrarian. Moving to Canaan meant leaving behind the wealth, comfort, and stability of Ur. You might think about it as moving from the big city, from big city mouse to small city mouse, and all the changes that come with it. There have always been movies and shows that take people out of the big city, take them out of their big homes, take them out of the comforts that they enjoyed, and putting them in these rougher spaces and these rougher terrains in these different societies with different people and maybe different languages, different cultures and different customs and all that other stuff. That's what's going on here. Abraham, at the tender age of 75, faces his life-altering decision when God calls out to him, "Go from your country, from your people, and from your father's household to the land that I will show you." It's not merely a simple call to travel. It's a call to leave everything familiar and beloved behind. God's command requires Abraham to walk away from the security and sophistication of Ur, from the family bonds that have shaped his life, and to embrace effectively an unknown future. It's an act of faith. It's a step into the unknown, guided only by a promise that he cannot see. Abraham has to trust that there is a purpose in this journey, even at the great personal cost involved. And so in dealing with this, I want to dive into three aspects, the three major themes of this decision-making process, of this journey, of this choice that Abraham makes. The isolation of that unseen vision, the psychological cost of leaving the known, and the weight of a legacy and deferred impact. Each of these themes reveals a different layer of Abraham's courage. It really is courage, courage to make this kind of decision, to make this kind of choice, and I think hold a lot of lessons for us. To add a quote, which I think really gets all of this, is a quote from William James, which says, "The greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that will outlast it." It's that whole legacy piece that we'll get to at the end. Abraham's journey invites us to consider, maybe for ourselves, what we are building today, but also what we're building beyond today into the future. I mentioned last week at the outset that a decision like the one that Noah had to bear is not one that I can attach to easily. But the decision that Abraham made to leave everything behind and to move to a foreign place is the story of every immigrant. Even though we have the ability where we live to speak in English and to operate in English and to work in English and to feel some level of comforts that we remember and had when we lived in America, making that decision and picking up and moving everyone, not at an early age per se, feels Abrahamic on some level. I'm not Abraham. I'm not saying that anyone who made this decision to move like this is Abraham. But I think there's something in there that we can recognize, that we can see in leaving the known behind, and to make a courageous decision to move. And so the first one is the isolation of an unseen vision. We'll get to the leaving behind in just a minute. Abraham's calling here was not a visible task. Whereas Noah, whose mission was to build a tangible ark and was to go into that ark and to live in that ark and take care of the animals in that ark and then to come out and rebuild all of society, Abraham's call was simply to go. There was no clear destination. There's no clearly defined purpose, only a command to leave. In the first year of coaching the Bible, I brought a quote from the book The Gift of the Jews by Thomas Cahill. It's a beautiful section there when he describes what it was that Abraham did, the revolution that was Abraham's decision and then action to go. But imagine for yourself being asked to embark on a journey that offers no concrete outcome, no visible sign of success, only faith in an invisible promise. Imagine asking your family to go with you on that journey. Where are we going? I don't know. How do we know we're going to get there? I don't know. How do we know if we succeeded? I don't know. For Abraham, this choice meant letting go of basically every worldly assurance, sustained only by his inner conviction that this journey held meaning. It's not an adventure that would be celebrated or even understood by those around him. It's effectively a solitary path, and one that others would likely mock or question. In the same way that when we think about Noah building the ark and his neighbors thinking, this is absurd, Abraham coming to his extended family and saying, hey guys, we're going on a journey. We're just leaving. We don't know where we're going. Yes, I'm old, but we're going anyway. I'm leaving you behind. We're never going to see each other again. I can imagine the ridicule that might have accompanied it. If he attached it to his belief system in the God that he recognized and the God that he believed in, can certainly appreciate the questioning and the mockery that went around Abraham at the time. The memes, the jokes, the tweets about crazy Uncle Abe who's moving his family from super cool Ur to the land of we don't know where. For him, it's the ability to carry that purpose alone without any sort of validation or any sort of encouragement. If you have been in that situation on some level, you may recognize that loneliness. It's a loneliness that comes with that vision or any vision. And the reality is that very few experience it on the level and the scale that Abraham did. Psychologists Budner and McLean, the details of which, who they were, when they operated, not crucial here, studied what it takes to thrive in the face of uncertainty. The research shows that individuals with a high tolerance for ambiguity can endure the discomfort of the unknown. You can appreciate that. If you can handle and you can hold either multiple truths or multiple opinions or a lack of an answer in your mind, then you can endure for much further along. I remember years ago, one of my first years teaching Talmud to high school students, one of my students just did not appreciate when it was that the Talmud section that we had studied didn't have a clear finish. There was no clear answer at the end. It sort of sometimes left it ambiguous until, years later, the Jewish law books come down and establish what the actual law is and what the practice is. Often the Talmud sort of leaves it in the dispute, and for that student, it just did not sit well to have ambiguity. They could not handle ambiguity, and I understand that. But for Abraham, ambiguity is effectively woven into every step of the journey. He believes in a future he could not yet see, creating that sense of tension, or as we talked about before, cognitive dissonance, between his loyalty to the known and his obedience to God's command. This dissonance required him to hold conflicting truths, an inner struggle that demanded immense resilience to sustain his purpose without clear answers. We have seen visionaries in the world who can hold multiple truths or conflicting truths at the same time. And we can appreciate where Abraham, possessing this kind of conviction, transcends typical, average, immediate understanding, and effectively, I've used that term 100 times already today, operating in a realm that few can actually access. Now stop for a minute here and reflect on Abraham's journey, just in this aspect. When have you felt, quote unquote, called to a purpose that others couldn't see or others couldn't understand? Maybe it's a calling from a professional standpoint. I'm not saying any specific business, but a type of work that you have to do. And no one understands why you have to do it or why you have to go and do that thing. Do something else. And if that's true for you, it doesn't have to be monumental like Abraham, but it could be just any decision that you made that required ultimately then isolation. What helped you stay committed when maybe you felt isolated? It's late at night, you're at an airport, you're in a hotel somewhere, on a trip for work, and you're alone. And it's bananas that you are there in that situation doing what you're doing. And in that isolation comes all the anxiety and the stress and the tension. So what helps you stay committed in there? What about the calling? What about the vision? What about the message? What about the why of it that keeps you committed? And on the flip side of that, perhaps consider, if you're ever turned away, if you've ever turned away from some sort of what you might call what could be considered a calling because of the isolation it required, what might you have gained by actually stepping forward and doing it anyway? So it's that extra, the motivational speakers talk about the extra rep or the extra paragraph or the extra sentence or the extra page or the extra mile or whatever it is. And the reason you didn't do it was because it was going to require of you and take from you a higher level of isolation and living in that ambiguity than you could perhaps consider and muster. So it's sort of two questions. What might you have gained if you had done it? What exactly about it, that isolation, is it that holds you back? And so that's issue number one here, is appreciating the isolation in an unseen vision. If you know people who are entrepreneurs, who build businesses, who have gone from, as Peter Thiel calls it, 0 to 1, so ask them that question. When they conceived of and thought about and dreamed about what it is that they built, what was it like late at night doing the work when nothing else is around? Issue number two for Abraham is leaving the known, the courageous choice to leave what is known for the unknown. Appreciate that God's command to Abraham unfolds really in a series of steps. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household. Each stage of that, your country, your people, and your father's household, each stage strips away an additional layer of his identity, each one harder than the last. First, he's asked to leave his country. Broader cultural connection, a sense of home that may feel manageable to leave behind. You're like, country doesn't mean that much to me, maybe. But next, he has to leave his people. Now we're talking about not just average people, his social circle, the extended family that grounded him, the community in where he lived. Aunts, uncles, friends. He's 75. There's people he's been with for many, many, many decades. People who he worked with, people who he celebrated with, people who he laughed and cried with, people whose children he helped bring up, even though at this point he didn't yet have any of his own. But maybe he's able to put that behind him. Then finally, he's commanded to leave his father's household, the closest bond of all, stepping away from his immediate family and his immediate legacy. Each layer brings him closer to a total detachment from his past. It's hard. It's really hard. In the modern world with modern tools and tech, so you're never fully disconnected like that. But 100 years ago, if a person left a small town and went to the big city to study, you may never see them again. And so his willingness to obey this command of God really goes against human nature. Most of us find the security in the familiar and staying close to loved ones and honoring those family ties. Abraham's the eldest son. He bears some sort of cultural and personal responsibility to his father. And had he refused the call to stay with family, his decision would have been understandable. What I mean by that is there are certain things that you don't cross. And maybe leaving family behind is not one that you cross, or leaving community or city or culture, moving on. Staying there is virtuous. Sometimes when that opportunity comes and requires of a person to leave it all behind, and they're weighing the decision, and they're not sure, they're in that space of indecision, part of it is the virtue of the loyalty of family and friends. And for Abraham, making the call and answering the call meant breaking away from everything, including this profound sense of duty. Yes, we know from the Bible that at the beginning of the stages of the journey, his father goes along with them on the journey, or the father even instigates and triggers the journey. But he doesn't get all the way. He has to leave him behind. One of the commentaries pointed out to me and shared to me by a friend this week when I was discussing with him this idea. He has to eschew, he has to leave behind, he has to break ties, he has to disconnect from the love and the connection and the relationship and the respect level of his family's home. And ask yourself, is there a point where loyalty might hold you back? Where the loyalty helps you or forces you to stay out of fear? And in what situation does your faith overcome your fear and your faith win out over your loyalty? This is another idea in cognitive dissonance that we've talked about before. Every progressive layer brings a greater psychological cost. Constantly, Abraham is reassessing his commitment, experiencing the mental strain that comes with opposing values and each layer being peeled away. And so once he gets across that he's okay to leave the country, he's okay to leave the community, now he has to dig deeper and think, can I leave the family behind too? Leaders might face this today. You might face this in your home and your community as well. Each sacrifice, each step forward brings you closer to your purpose, but it adds heavy, heavy layers of emotional cost. If you're the immigrant, as I mentioned earlier, so then leaving family, culture, community behind, friends, very much faces the same progression of loss and hope, and very much goes through that decision-making process of, can I bear this? Am I okay with this? How do I handle this? It comes with deep psychological challenge and emotional ramifications. There's no way around that. And so it asks the question of you, what sacrifices are you willing to make when the calling comes? And when do you need to step beyond what's comfortable to pursue something greater? And then perhaps the question as to when is it that loyalty becomes a hindrance to your growth? And then what do you do then? How do you square that? How do you deal with that? How do you live with those decisions? How do you bear the psychological and emotional cost that comes with that? So that's number 2. And number 3 issues the weight of the legacy and the deferred impact. Abraham's decision to leave Ur is not motivated by immediate reward or personal gain. Again, it's not like Noah, who's going into an ark to save his family, to save the animals, and to then survive in there to rebuild society later on. At 75, Abraham is creating a future he may never actually see fulfilled. A future that's ultimately promised to his descendants. That we know to be true. He starts the process, but he doesn't see the end of the process. And for Abraham, though, this journey was about building the legacy, the investment in a world that would exist beyond his own life. The choice to live for a legacy that we cannot see reflects a kind of radical faith, one that follows values, one that puts foundations in place and foundations as an optimal more than personal recognition. Abraham is a seed planter. Abraham is the one who's putting the trees in the ground and establishing roots and foundations and the core of what's going to be. But he's not going to be the one to see the fruit, bear the fruit, benefit from the fruit years later, generations later. That's not him. And for today's leader, who are pressured, understandably so on some level, to achieve the short-term and immediate success, Abraham's choice challenges our understanding of success itself. The modern-day business leader, the modern-day community leader, they want to see the change happen. They want to see the growth happen today. They want to see more sales today. They want to see more people moving into your community today. What have you? But to establish that you're going to live for a legacy that's going to outlive you reinterprets the ideas of what success is. It's hard to disagree with the idea that Abraham was a success. But in his generation, in his time, he was one man with no family. I mean, he had a wife and a nephew, and some people and a servant. No children at the time. Here's this calling from God to go, and he goes. Like, what's going to be with that? And so Abraham fundamentally challenges the idea of what success is going to be. If you define success as legacy that only bears fruit generations down the line, then you have a different definition. And he understands that a meaningful life sometimes means just planting the seeds without expecting to see the tree grow, without expecting to see any of the blossoms and the blooming or any of the fruit that's ultimately going to come. What's been borne out from the research, and you certainly hear this from motivational speakers as well, and I've read this in many books, is that those who can delay gratification often are able to achieve greater long-term success. Again, a person who's able to hold off on the gratification part of the work that they're doing, ultimately, is to have greater long-term success. So for Abraham, deferring the personal comfort to create a future for others required an intense level of commitment and a high level of appreciation of the value of legacy over the short-term success. It fits very nicely into the concept brought up by Viktor Frankl that a person can handle any sort of the hardship for a purpose that's beyond themselves. And so Abraham's journey illustrates these things quite powerfully. His legacy was not in immediate awards or immediate rewards, but in the generations that would carry his story and his belief system and his faith forward. A lot of people like that. You could talk about Mandela. You could talk about the founding fathers in the United States. You could talk about religious leaders other than Abraham who exemplified that same spirit of legacy. You could talk about philanthropists, people who put in place gifts and impact on society well after they're gone. You could see it in people who wrote books or who made music or who impacted culture, maybe less so during their lifetime and more so much later on. And so for me, it leaves us with a set of questions about this as well. If we're going to reflect here, let's reflect for just a moment. Take a moment here and think about legacy that you're building. What's the legacy that you're building that's going to outlast you? Obviously, if it's legacy, it's supposed to outlast. But what is that? What's the thing you're going to be remembered about later on? And then how do you now reimagine and reevaluate success when it's based on a vision that extends beyond your lifetime? What's a new definition of success for you if that's the definition of success? And if that's true, then what are the sacrifices today that you're willing to make for a cause that benefits others more than yourself, and that will have a benefit down the generations more than it has in this generation? It's hard. It's hard to see that. It's hard to think about that. It's hard to operate in that way when, of course, there are immediate short-term needs as well. But if we're going to go in that space, ask a different question. At what point does the pursuit of legacy become too much? When you're putting too much of an emphasis on legacy as opposed to the current moment. When it overwhelms and takes over everything that you're about and everything that you're doing. Is that worth it? Is that sacrifice worth it? Is the burden it places on you too much for you? And also ask, how do you balance living fully in the present, right, while also building for a future that you may never see? Is that fair? Is that appropriate? Is that okay? When you think about these different things that Abraham is struggling with, that he is trying to balance, that he is working through in the decision to go to the land of Canaan, and you can extract from there and then place it on yourself, I think it's a lot. Abraham's story asks us to consider what we are building not just for ourselves, but for the future generations. And it takes us back to the quote from William James earlier, which is at the essence of Abraham's journey, that the greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that will outlast it. And so when we think about Abraham's journey, in the same way that we talked about Noah in the ark, and that the journey wasn't just in the ark, Abraham's journey isn't just about leaving home. It is a profound commitment to a purpose he couldn't fully understand and a legacy he would never see. His decision laid the foundation for countless generations, billions upon billions of people. And it shows that making lasting impact can often come from choices made in solitude, in isolation, and of course in sacrifice. And it invites us to consider the sacrifice we're willing to make for a purpose that's greater than ourselves. Real leadership often requires us to choose uncertain paths, to build legacies that others may benefit from more than we do. Abraham challenges us to live with a sense of purpose that transcends comfort, building something that outlasts our own lives. And as we reflect on his journey, maybe we can find the courage to step forward in our journey with greater conviction, to embrace an unknown, to leave behind a legacy that inspires those who are willing and wanting to follow. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. I do look forward to seeing you next week. Of course, as always, I invite you to share your feedback, your comments, your critiques, your criticisms, your questions, your additional insights that may come along as you go through. I know this went long. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you're enjoying this new series. The work to prepare it, to go into it, for me has been very fulfilling, very meaningful, very thoughtful, very deep. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we dive into another level of indecision.